A cold wind rolls across the North Sea, carrying with it the cries of gulls and the groan of a longship's hull. Imagine standing on a rocky shore more than 1,000 years ago, where the air tastes of salt and wood smoke. Here, in the lands of the Norse, honor was life itself, and punishment for dishonor could be as chilling as the winter sea. Among the stories told around Viking hearths, none is as haunting or as hotly debated as the so-called blood eagle. But was this gruesome execution real, or has time inflated a tale into legend? To understand, we must step into the world of Viking justice, where law, vengeance, and reputation shaped every man and woman's fate. The Vikings were far more than raiders. They were farmers, traders, poets, and lawmakers, bound by codes of honor that kept their close-knit communities alive. When someone broke those codes, by betrayal, theft, or murder, the price was steep. Punishments ranged from fines and exile to death, depending on the crime and the standing of those involved. At the heart of their legal culture was the Thing, an open-air assembly where free people gathered to settle disputes. Here, witnesses swore oaths, judges weighed evidence, and sentences were proclaimed. In most cases, the system sought balance rather than cruelty. Compensation, restitution, or outlawry, which stripped an offender of all protection under the law. But among the sagas and skaldic verses, a darker possibility lurks. A ritual called the blood eagle appears in several medieval texts, described as an execution so horrific it seems carved from nightmare. According to these accounts, the victim was laid face down, the ribs severed from the spine, and the lungs pulled outward to resemble the wings of a great bird. Some versions claim salt was rubbed into the wounds, heightening the agony. The act was said to be reserved for traitors or enemies of exceptional infamy, carried out as a warning and a display of vengeance. The first challenge for any historian is the source material. Most descriptions of the blood eagle appear in texts written centuries after the events they claim to describe. The Orkneyinga saga mentions it as a fate inflicted on a rival earl. The Heimskringla, a compilation of Norse kings' sagas, includes another reference. There are also hints in the Poetic Edda, couched in cryptic kennings and verse. Yet these texts were composed by Christian scribes, often far removed from the pagan age they chronicled. Were they faithfully recording old practices, or coloring stories with their own ideas of martyrdom and cruelty? To probe deeper, scholars analyze language. One Old Norse phrase, rista orna baki, literally means to carve an eagle on the back. It appears in several contexts, sometimes clearly meaning to mark or wound someone in the shape of an eagle, rather than unfolding lungs into wings. Could the blood eagle be a metaphor for violent revenge, later misread as a literal execution? Or did it describe a real, if rare, form of punishment reserved for the gravest betrayals? While the blood eagle dominates popular imagination, it wasn't the only form of Viking justice. Outlawry, for instance, was a severe sentence that left the condemned without legal protection. Anyone could kill an outlaw without penalty, forcing them to flee or perish. Fines, known as wergild, compensated victims' families, establishing a scale of payment for injuries and deaths. Even banishment across the sea, a fate given to some exiles in Icelandic law, could be a living death in an unforgiving world. These punishments reveal a culture concerned with restoring balance, not indulging in brutality for its own sake. Yet Viking society also prized spectacle. Public punishments reinforced social order and warned others against defiance. In poetry, vengeance was celebrated in soaring language. Eagles feeding on the slain, ravens circling battlefields, wolves fattened on traitors. Birds of prey symbolized fate and retribution, their wings echoing in the saga of the blood eagle. Whether or not the ritual was real, the image fit neatly into a worldview where honor was defended with steel and betrayal paid for in blood. Archaeology offers tantalizing clues but no certainty. Skeletal remains from the Viking Age show evidence of violent deaths, sword cuts, decapitations, even bound limbs, but no undisputed signs of a ribcage flayed open in the described manner. Some scholars suggest that if the blood eagle occurred, it may have been extremely rare, leaving little physical trace. Others argue the procedure, as described, would be almost impossible on a living victim, lending weight to the idea that the saga writers misunderstood a poetic phrase or embellished an execution to heighten drama. Still, the story persists perhaps because it speaks to something larger than historical fact. It embodies the tension between myth and memory, justice and terror, that runs through much of Viking lore. Just as the dragon Fafnir guarded gold or Odin hung upon Yggdrasil, the blood eagle haunts the imagination as a symbol of ultimate reckoning. Its endurance reminds us how stories of punishment can grow, fed by fear and fascination, until they become as legendary as the deeds they claim to recount. As the Viking Age unfolded, spanning from the late 8th century to the 11th, law codes developed alongside raiding and settlement. The Norse brought their legal traditions to places as far-flung as Dublin, York, and Kiev. Everywhere they went, they balanced the sharp edge of the sword with the spoken word of the law. In Iceland, the Gragas, literally grey goose, preserved early statutes, while in Norway, King Magnus, the lawmender, sought to standardize rules across his realm. Within these codes, there is no explicit mention of the blood eagle, suggesting that if it happened, it lay outside the formal justice system, belonging instead to private vengeance or ritual drama. When we picture a Viking punishment, we might imagine a windswept hilltop, a crowd gathered to witness the fate of an oathbreaker. There is smoke from pine torches, the hiss of iron pulled from the fire, the silent weight of judgment. Yet we should also remember the quieter forms of discipline. A fine paid in silver, an exile trudging to a ship, a feud settled with a handshake at the thing. Violence and order were two sides of the same coin in Norse life, and both were essential to maintaining the fragile bonds of kinship and loyalty. The blood eagle debate, then, is about more than one shocking tale. It invites us to consider how history is shaped by those who tell it. A punishment described in verse may become, through repetition and imagination, a fixed fact, even if its roots are tangled in metaphor. The truth may lie somewhere in between, in a rare act of vengeance exaggerated by storytellers, or in a misunderstanding passed down as literal truth. By studying these stories carefully, we learn not only about Viking law but also about how humans everywhere weave fear, justice, and legend into the fabric of memory. Across Scandinavia, runestones stand silent, carved with names of the dead and the deeds of the living. Some praise warriors who avenged kin. Others honor women who kept farms alive while men sailed abroad. These stones remind us that Viking society was complex, built on bonds of duty, faith, and courage. Whatever the truth behind the blood eagle, it remains a window into a world where punishment, honor, and myth were inseparable, and where the line between history and legend was as thin as the edge of a Sikh's blade. To grasp why the blood eagle endures in popular memory, we must look at how Viking punishments reflected the values of their time. Above all, they were about reputation. A person's drengskaper, their honor and standing, mattered as much as land or silver. If someone threatened that standing through betrayal or cowardice, justice was not only a matter of law but of restoring balance before the gods and the community. Vengeance occupied a central place in Norse culture. Feuds between families could smolder for generations, and sagas celebrate heroes who avenged wrongs despite overwhelming odds. Yet vengeance had limits. It was meant to be proportionate and public, ensuring the settlement of disputes rather than endless chaos. Outlawry offered a formal outlet for bloodshed, stripping a wrongdoer of protection and allowing others to exact punishment. In that framework, an execution like the blood eagle, if it ever occurred, would have stood apart, less a legal sentence than a message etched in flesh for all to see. Medieval writers may have emphasized such tales to portray pagan Vikings as barbaric in contrast to Christian norms. The chronicler Ethelwerd, for instance, described Viking cruelty in England with a moralizing tone, casting them as savage enemies of the faith. Later scribes compiling sagas could have seized on evocative imagery to thrill audiences or underscore the wages of treachery. Poetry, with its layered metaphors, added to the confusion. When a skald spoke of eagles feeding on the back of a foe, was it a reference to birds devouring corpses on a battlefield, or to a ritual execution given avian form? Modern historians and medical experts have attempted to test the plausibility of the blood eagle. Anatomical studies suggest that cutting through the ribs from behind while a person remained alive would be extraordinarily difficult. The lungs, once displaced, would not resemble outstretched wings, and the victim would likely die quickly from shock and blood loss. These findings lend weight to the argument that the ritual, as popularly described, could not have been carried out exactly as the texts claim, at least not as a prolonged spectacle. But even if the blood eagle never happened as written, other punishments demonstrate that Vikings could be severe when they believed justice or honor demanded it. Some sources mention stoning adulterers, drowning female slaves accused of theft, or hanging criminals in sacred groves. Execution by beheading or hanging was known, especially for crimes like murder or sorcery. Ships' crews sometimes cast mutinous sailors overboard, leaving them to the mercy of the sea. These practices, though harsh, were embedded in a world where law sought to contain violence, not to erase it altogether. Another reason the blood eagle grips us is its theatricality. It aligns with our image of the Vikings as bold and fearsome, living lives steeped in poetry and steel. In television dramas and novels, the ritual becomes a shorthand for Viking ruthlessness, a scene meant to shock viewers and cement the idea of a savage age. Yet focusing only on such extremes risks distorting the past. The same people who may have carved an eagle on an enemy's back also built ships of astonishing craftsmanship, composed haunting verses, and governed through assemblies that valued consensus. The debate also reveals how societies everywhere use punishment stories to define morality. Whether real or imagined, the blood eagle warned that betrayal could bring consequences beyond death. It dramatized loyalty, courage, and the high price of treachery. In that sense, it functioned less as a manual for justice than as a mirror of cultural ideals. By studying it critically, we separate history from hyperbole while appreciating the values encoded in legend. As Norse culture gave way to Christian kingdoms, attitudes toward violence shifted. Laws became more standardized, and church influence promoted penance over blood vengeance. By the High Middle Ages, legal codes in Scandinavia emphasized fines, imprisonment, or execution by simpler means, such as hanging or beheading. Saga writers, looking back, may have embroidered older tales to emphasize how far society had come, or to keep alive the drama of a heroic age. In the end, the blood eagle occupies a peculiar place in historical inquiry. It is simultaneously a question of forensic possibility, linguistic interpretation, and narrative tradition. Its details may never be resolved with certainty, but its significance lies in how it illuminates the interplay between fact and folklore. It reminds us that punishment is not just about inflicting pain. It is also about telling a story, of justice served, of warnings heeded, of reputations avenged. Picture the scene one last time. A storm gathers over a Scandinavian fjord, waves hammering against stone. A figure stands accused, surrounded by warriors whose faces flicker in torchlight. Somewhere in the crowd, a poet readies his words, knowing that whatever happens next will echo through generations. Whether the condemned is simply struck down or made to endure a ritual few dared name aloud, the act will live on in verse, shaping how future ages see the Viking world. The lesson is clear. When we speak of the blood eagle, we are speaking as much about how history is remembered as about what truly occurred. Punishment, myth, and identity intertwine, leaving us with a riddle carved into the past. And as long as we seek to understand those who came before, their fears, their justice, their legends, the story of the blood eagle will remain, hovering between shadow and truth like an eagle poised above its prey.